Facebook connections. And the reason that I show this map is because we are moving into a new time, unprecedented in human history, when science is transforming everything. It's influencing every aspect of life. And I want you to think about what happens to Thomas Jefferson's idea about the well-informed voter in a time like this, when science influences everything from the most intimate details of sex and reproduction to the most public, grand challenges of the economy, climate change, and global economic development. What happens to democracy in a world like that? Right now, we are expecting that over the next 40 years, we're going to create as much new knowledge as we have in the last 400 years. Now think about that, and think about some of the amazing transformations that have happened just in the last 100 years alone. And think about some of the vast political discussions that we've gotten into because of that. That suggests that the next 40 years are going to be the most challenging in human history. And part of what Matthew and I work on is elevating discussion of these problems, of these global science challenges in democracy, because there is a growing gap between the power that science is giving to the individual and the vast effects that that is happening as the individual exercises that power with global repercussions. So is our form of government, democracy, able to bridge that gap between what we can do and our policy-making process? And that's what we seek to do, is to bridge that gap by elevating discussion in our public policy forum. Now, some of the examples of the way that this can happen are, for instance, the iPhone. Many of you here have one, but for many people, the iPhone is about the same thing as magic. They are both created by people cloistered away, wearing long robes, and speaking strange incantations. And they do magical things. And if you don't understand the details of the level of engineering that goes into an iPhone, or the particle physics that goes behind the function of its screen and some of its internal electronics, it may as well be magic. And that's part of the problem. Right now, we are entering a new era when science is so complex and the collection of human knowledge is so vast and so broad that, as you people talk about, no one person can know anything, everything of the truth. And that has never been truer than it is now. And if that's the case, the problem is that science then, for many people, becomes a matter of belief. And then it's a question of what do you believe in? Because if you don't have the time to read the entirety of all the scientific journals and understand all the scientific papers that are published on a monthly or even weekly basis, what do you trust in? How do you think about things? Well, scientists generally trust in the scientific process and the process of peer review. You have to have faith that that system is functioning properly. But that also makes it vulnerable to politics and to propaganda. And I'll give you a few examples. In 2011, the World Health Organization issued a report, made headlines around the world. You may have remembered seeing some of those headlines. The headline said basically that your cell phone may give you brain cancer. World Health Organization saying this. The interesting thing about this, though, is that if you read the entire report and then you read the underlying statistics, there was a little statistical blip that was mentioned in a footnote at the bottom. And the footnote said that the blip that we've noticed is indistinguishable from chance. So, yes, it's possible that they may, but in science, anything is regarded as possible. Science is about probability. And there's been no epidemiological or other scientific evidence to support the idea that they do. And in fact, there's a great deal of evidence from science to show that they don't. For instance, consider basic high school physics. Here's an example from the NASA website of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, if you look at microwaves, they're at the very low end of that spectrum. A little bit more energetic than radio waves, but far less energetic than the infrared radiation that each of us in this room is giving off right now. Sitting here at rest, we're giving off perhaps 80 watts each, something like that. Far less than most cell phones. But the most important thing is the energy amongst each of those waves, or the photons that are with their associated waveforms. For a photon to have enough energy to give you cancer, it has to be in the low end of the ultraviolet range or the high end of the visible light range. That's why we use sunscreen. That's why our bodies produce melanin. That is about 1 million times more energetic than the energy in a microwave. Now, the reason that that can cause cancer is that it has enough energy to knock an electron out of a carbon atom, ionizing that carbon atom, thus changing its chemical component, its ability to bind, and altering DNA. You have to know, though, a little bit of physics, a little bit of chemistry, a little bit of biology to put those things together. And that's where that vulnerability and that belief comes from. Now, to give you an example of that, later on last year, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, all Democrats, I should say, thus anti-science can be on both sides of the political spectrum, voted 10 to 1 to require every cell phone shop in San Francisco to warn customers that their cell phones may give them brain cancer. Despite the fact that there is no scientific epidemiological evidence to support this, and in fact that it's contradicted by basic physics. So that's the kind of thing, that's an example of regulation run amok, really. Regulation that is not based on evidence and is not based on the well-informed voter. Now, let me give you an example from the other side of the spectrum. Climate change. We've heard a lot about that and about Republican issues with climate change lately. Here is an example of the Arctic sea ice extent. This is measured throughout the year, but it's always really noted in September, when Arctic sea ice is always at its warmest, or at its lowest level, because the temperature is warmest in the Arctic at that point. This year, as you may have noticed or heard in the headlines, Arctic sea ice reached its lowest extent since we've been measuring. Now we can take that chart and we can highlight it, we can take it out, and we can invert it, and we could call it the Arctic open water extent. It's essentially the same thing, it's an inverse function. But when you do that, what's interesting is you can correlate certain things, right? Open water is expanding as ice is shrinking. Now, part of the reason why this is concerning to climate scientists is that as ice melts out of the Arctic is not reflecting as much sunlight back into space. It decreases the Earth's albedo, and that extra exposed open water then absorbs more of that radiation and heats up. And that creates a feedback loop that begins to melt more ice and contribute to more warming. So that's why climate scientists are concerned about it. Now, let's take that Arctic open water extent and we can overlay it with some other statistical charts over that same 30-year time frame. For instance, declared federal disasters. Now, I understand over the next few days, you guys are facing the possibility of a declared federal disaster in this general area. Hopefully everyone here will be all right. But Hurricane Sandy is gaining a lot of strength, and there's a lot of talk right now amongst the climate scientists and meteorologists that I know that are very concerned about this, and that are exploring the ways that climate science may be contributing to this. Now, I should say that climate science is not about predicting the weather, but it's similar to, for instance, the question of Barry Bonds. You couldn't say that steroid use or alleged steroid use caused any one of Barry Bonds' home runs, but it elevated his base state. And that extra energy is what climate scientists are talking about. Now, if we look at declared federal disasters, Arctic open water extent, we overlay them with global land ocean surface temperature. And we see some interesting correlations over the last 30-some years. And when we overlay that yet again with something called the Keeling curve, that forms a trend line. The Keeling curve is the measurement of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Named after Charles David Keeling, it's become such an important chart in science that it's etched on the wall of the National Academy of Sciences in Washington. And what he noted, as you'll see in those little pink squiggles that go up and down there, is that in the spring and summer, as plant life explodes in the northern hemisphere, where most of the land mass on the globe is, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere falls because the plant life is absorbing it as it grows. Then in the fall and winter, as that plant life dies and decomposes, carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere and it climbs back up. So that's this jagged up-down that we're seeing there. But what he also noticed, starting in the late 1950s when he began measuring this, is that every year, every month, was higher than the corresponding month in the prior year. That the chart was climbing and climbing and climbing. And that led first hundreds and then thousands of scientists to go in to the field of geophysics and climate science to begin to try to understand what was happening, the relationship to human activity, if there was any, and what we might be able to do about it. Now, pulling that out, this is where it intersects with policy, with the rest of us, those of us who aren't climate scientists. For instance, this is a chart pulled out from a global reinsurer called Munich Re. They reinsure U.S. property and casualty companies, and every year they issue something called the Natural Catastrophe Update. And you'll notice that they break down insurance claims into a variety of categories. The green is meteorological. The orange is climatological, meaning temperature extremes, wildfires, things like that. And the blue is hydrological, which is flooding, mass movement of water. Those three categories that are related to climate have quadrupled in the last 30 years. The other categories of loss, as you'll see represented by the red, have stayed relatively constant. What this means for states like Florida, for instance, is that the taxpayers are increasingly being exposed to financial risk because insurance companies are pulling out of states like Florida because the risk is too high and they won't reinsure there, so the taxpayers are providing more and more reinsurance. Taxpayers are the final stop. That makes it into a very important public policy discussion. So knowing that this is an important public policy discussion, it becomes somewhat surprising that 94 of the 100 GOP members of Congress elected in 2010 either deny that climate change is happening at all or have signed pledges to oppose any efforts at mitigation. Now, consider the views of John Shimkus from Illinois, who sits on the House Subcommittee on Environment and the Economy. And this is in a committee hearing on climate science. And notice in particular the scientific paper that he is referencing in this discussion.
The earth will end only when God declares it's time to be over. Man will not destroy this earth. This earth will not be destroyed by a flood. And I appreciate having panelists here who are men of faith, and we can get into the theological discourse of that position. But I do believe God's word is infallible, unchanging, perfect. Two other issues, Mr. Chairman. Today we have about 388 parts per million in the atmosphere. I think in the age of the dinosaurs where we had most flora and fauna, we were probably at 4,000 parts per million. There is a theological debate that this is a carbon starved planet.
Now, it's hard to know where to start with this one. Correct me, those of you who are biblical scholars in the room. I don't remember reading anything about carbon dioxide in the Bible. Maybe I missed it. But why this is problematic is that this man is responsible for making policy around this issue. And what is he referring to? That gilded scientific report that he is waving in his hand. He's referring to received wisdom. He's not referring to, for instance, the time-binding process of building on past wisdom. He's going back to the original source and trying to base public policy decisions on that source. Consider another example. Now, Speaker Boehner is arguably the second most powerful man in the United States government. As Speaker, he controls the flow of legislation through the House of Representatives. Here he is on national television discussing climate change.
We have to deal with this in a responsible way. So what is the responsibility? That's my question. What is the Republican plan to deal with carbon emissions, which every major scientific organization has said is contributing
think he's right. It is almost comical. But here's a man on national television, and he's trying to be very earnest about his position. But there are no climate scientists that say that carbon dioxide is a carcinogen, number one. Otherwise, plants would be giving us cancer, left and right. And number two, I don't think that cows fart carbon dioxide. I may be wrong, but I think that they fart methane. But if this is his level of knowledge on the issue, it doesn't give me a great deal of confidence that there is serious science-based discussion of the issue going on in Congress. And that's where the problem runs into, where we run into a problem, again, with the well-informed voter and the role of information and science in our public policy making in the 21st century, when science influences our lives more than at any other time in history. So where is this gap coming from, and what is going on? Are the people still well enough informed to be trusted with their own government? Now, I think that this particular picture, I like this one. It works because of both sides held together. It wouldn't be as effective without. Judging from Congress, the answer is no. There they are, hard at work on their laptops. Of the 535 members of Congress, how many do you suppose have a professional background in science? 10, 11. You guys are kind of cynical. 9. Yeah, 9. Less than 2%, according to Congressional Research Service. 1 physicist, 1 chemist, 6 engineers, and a microbiologist. By contrast, how many do you suppose are lawyers? Any guesses? Close. 222. So it's a little wonder that we see more rhetoric-driven discussion of policy issues going on in Congress than knowledge-based discussion. But that becomes a problem when we have big public policy decisions that have big inputs from science. Because those of you who are attorneys in the room will hopefully attest that the goal of a well-articulated argument from an attorney is to rely on the judicial system, and you rely on the judge or the jury. You make your argument on behalf of your client. The opposing counsel makes their argument on behalf of their client, and we rely on the judge, the jury, or in this case, Congress, the body as a whole, to decide, based on the arguments offered, who has made the most compelling case. But if we're not taking inputs from knowledge, if we're strictly making rhetorical arguments back and forth, we can easily get into problems and become misled in our public policy making process. One of the big causes of this is the elimination of something called the Office of Technology Assessment, which was eliminated in 1994, I believe. That was Congress's nonpartisan science advisory body. Since then, members largely turned to lobbyists and the internet for their science information. And we all know that the internet is a completely accurate source of scientific information. But that was a joke, by the way. But nevertheless, members really need a sounder source when making decisions in this century. So there's 2 key concepts I want you to think about in this discussion as we go forward. One is that science is never partisan, but the other is that science is always political. And the reason that I say this is because of this chart, which is in the book. Science is neither left nor right. And in fact, I would argue that our continuum in politics is not just a left-right continuum, it is actually a 2-dimensional plane. There's also a top-down argument going on. And I'm going to explain a little bit in a moment why that's important. First of all, scientists are very conservative. They're never going to stick their neck out there unless they have researched all the existing literature on a topic that they're considering publishing on, to find out if somebody has already published on that, if anything that has been published might undermine or refute the claim that they're about to make, if somebody has thought of something that they haven't thought of that changes their interpretation of their evidence, because all of those things are quickly ways to damage your career. You don't want to embarrass yourself by publishing something that doesn't advance knowledge and that's easily and quickly refuted by something that's already been published. So you're very conservative. But by the same time, you're also very progressive. You're open to new ideas wherever they come from. And you quickly embrace them because that is where new knowledge is to be found, is on the frontiers. That's where new discoveries are always made. So scientists are both conservative and progressive at the same time. So science is really never partisan. But science is always political, and I would suggest that a lot of the political struggle that we're seeing these days is not so much a partisan struggle as it's a top-down struggle between authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism. And this is why, for instance, we can see Republicans who have been forced out of their party and silenced because authoritarians say that it's bad to be liberal. Well, it's actually it's possible, if you look at this, liberal is a top position. It's not a left position. It's possible to be a liberal Republican. It's possible to be conservative and liberal at the same time. Because what liberalism is about it's about freedom. It's about openness to new ideas. It's about anti-authoritarianism. It's about saying, I'm not going to accept anything on faith, just like science. Show me the evidence and I'll judge for myself. Okay, so it's withholding of judgment. Authoritarianism, on the other hand, is about ideology and judgment, generally speaking. There are authoritarian religions and anti-authoritarian religions. There are authoritarian governments and anti-authoritarian governments. Democracy is decidedly an anti-authoritarian system because it takes nothing on faith. It's based on the will of the people, not on the will of the king or the pope. There are governments that can be decidedly anti-science that are authoritarian, on the left and right. Maoist China was very anti-science, jailed scientists. Mao regarded intellectuals as dangerous anti-revolutionaries. But also, while Nazi Germany initially adopted science and technology, eventually their intolerance drove scientists out of the country, creating one of the greatest intellectual boons the United States has experienced. So, this argument going on right now places science in a very political position as a top wing position, opposed to authoritarians. And the reason that science is political in that way is that new knowledge either confirms or challenges vested interests, be they economic or ideological. So if you have a big coal company and science comes out that suggests that some portion of your economic model is causing environmental damage that you might be responsible for, or health damage that you might be responsible for, that's an existential challenge to you. So your motivation is certainly going to be to oppose regulation and perhaps to fight the underlying science behind that regulation and maybe find alternative arguments in order to survive. Well, the same thing happens with ideological vested interests. And a good example is Galileo and the Catholic Church in 1633. Just the act of looking through a telescope, confirming Copernicus's idea that the Earth went around the sun and not the other way around, was regarded as heresy. Well, the Catholic Church at that time was the seat of world economic and political power. So think about that. What's the seat of world economic and political power today? Arguably, it's the U.S. energy industry. Exxon is the first or second most valuable publicly traded company in the world. Koch Industries is the second most valuable privately traded company in the United States. So when there is $1 trillion, maybe $2, maybe $3 trillion worth of carbon left in the ground, it's worth $1 billion a year to spread disinformation to protect your economic model. So to combat the threat of tyranny from vested interests, the Pope, the royalty, the wealthy royalty, Jefferson really wanted to concern himself with how we know things. Being a scientist, he was in a very, very dangerous position. Imagine yourself sitting there in Jacob Graff's 2 rented rooms in Philadelphia, very hot, it's the summer, 2nd floor, and you're there and you've been charged with writing the Declaration of Independence. And if you fail, what's going to happen? It's going to give an opening to a lot of different countries to intervene, either on behalf of England or as third-party interlopers to try and control the outcome. Either way, you're going to die, and so are your friends. So what kind of argument can you make? The most powerful argument that Jefferson could make was not one based on religion. He turned to the ideas of science. And who he turned to was what he called his trinity of three greatest men. Isaac Newton, the creator of physics, Francis Bacon, the creator of inductive reasoning, and John Locke, the creator of empiricism. And the reason that he turned to them was that he needed to base an argument not on religious authority, but on an intrinsic authority that would work no matter what your religion. Now, let's back up a little bit and look at some of the foundations of the argument that he turned to. Martin Luther in 1517 asked a similar question in a different way when he posted those 95 theses on the Catholic Church door, and he argued that the Catholic Church had become corrupt because the Pope in Rome, he said, who is richer than the richest Crassus, which was a very wealthy despot in Rome, was seeking indulgences. He was charging indulgences, as you may remember, from all kinds of parishioners. You could pay an indulgence and be forgiven of your sins and get back into heaven. And he was using that money to build St. Peter's Basilica. This Luther found very offensive. He thought it was corruption, and he thought that if the people really understood the Bible, they would realize it too. So he translated the Bible from his Greek and Roman into German. And that created a split in Western thinking. And it was the birth of Western anti-authoritarianism. He said, much like scientists say, don't take the word of authority. See for yourself. Look at the evidence for yourself. There it is. I printed it for you in the Bible. That's your evidence. Read it. See what it says. The Bible sold 100,000 copies, the Luther Bible. Vast bestseller for its time. Huge. Bigger than anything else in history up until that point. And the Reformation changed history. Puritans, who we hear over and over again from people like Michelle Bachmann, who talk about how they settled the country and that they settled it on the basis of religion. Yes, to a certain extent that's true. But Puritans were also very pro-science. In fact, 62% of the members of the Royal Academy of Sciences in London were Puritans. And the reason that they were pro-science is that they believed that there were two forms of revelation. There was the book of Revelation, which was the Bible, and there was the book of nature, which was God's will. And this is taking that anti-authoritarian thinking of Luther even a bit further and saying, don't look at the Bible alone. If you really want to discern God's will, see for yourself. Look at nature, and you can determine God's wills by seeing what his laws are in nature. At the time, they called this natural philosophy. Natural philosophy, in turn, became what we now call science. Now, moving on about 150 years, John Locke started looking at all the different sects of Protestantism, each of them claiming to be the one true path to God. I'm the true path. No, I'm the true path. No, we're the true path over here. No, we're the true path over here. And he said, there has to be some way of knowing what is true. And it led him to ask the question, how do we know things? How do we know what's true? So he wrote something called an essay concerning human understanding, and he defined knowledge as something that must pass three tests. And this was the birth of empiricism, which underlies all of our modern science today. First of all, if it's to be knowledge, it must be intuitive. Some examples of intuitive knowledge is 1 + 1 = 2. Black is not white. There's no such thing as a square circle. Things that are implicitly obvious. That is the strongest form of knowledge. Then there's demonstrative knowledge, built up of pieces of intuitive knowledge. For instance, a penny and a feather fall at different rates, but if I put them in a vacuum tube and I suck out the air, they fall at the same rate. Therefore, I conclude that air must have some density. So that's an example of demonstrative knowledge. Finally, the third test is sensitive knowledge. I can smell a smell and it smells like a rose, so I can conclude that there is probably a rose near. But he said that this is the most qualified form of knowledge because we can easily be misled by our senses. Common sense is not commonsensical. For instance, sometimes a rose is just perfume. Sometimes the lake that I see is just a mirage. Anything, he said, that fell short of one of these, with whatever assurance soever embraced, is but faith or opinion, but not knowledge, at least in all general truths. This was the foundation of much of Western science, but it was also the foundation that Jefferson, who studied Locke, who honored him as one of his trinity of three greatest men, turned to when writing the Declaration. Here's an example of an early draft of the Declaration of Independence, and I bring it up to show just how difficult this thinking was, this emergence of empiricism from ideological thinking that Jefferson and others had been brought up in. They were trying to define an entirely new way of thought. And here's the example right here. Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal." Why was that a problem? He handed it over to Benjamin Franklin and said, "Would you take a look at this draft?" And Franklin scratched out "sacred and undeniable" there and wrote in "self-evident." And arguably, that is the foundation of the separation of church and state that has enabled the United States to be the world leader. And arguably, that's where we've got it wrong in the Arab Spring, because we haven't insisted on secular democracy as the most important form of democracy. That separation, the protection of religion from government and government from religion, so people of a variety of faiths can coexist. And we don't get into the argument that Locke was so concerned with. We base government on knowledge, not on ideology. So by saying that we hold these truths to be self-evident, what Jefferson was seeking to do was to create a more limited, more defined argument for democracy. He was saying, I'm not going to get into the ideological argument with anyone who is of a different faith than I am, because that would give them justification to invade, to intervene. I have to make an argument that, as John Locke argued, takes the mind to the point at which it bottoms, which means taking it back to the point at which it bottoms in the physical world, based on knowledge, based on evidence. It was self-evident. So, taking this forward, what is happening in our discourse today? Why don't we have people like Jefferson today? What has happened to transform our public dialogue to the point where it's become acceptable for politicians to be anti-science? Well, part of that is determined by the broader political public dialogue that we've experienced over the last 50 years in science. And I want to briefly go over some of the emotional movements of that dialogue. Now, early on, about 100 years ago, the beginning of the last century, science was the source of vast economic wealth and great national pride. New discoveries were quickly commercialized through technology, made vast sums of money, and made life much, much easier. So science was, everybody was pro-science, with some exceptions. But by the mid-1940s, when we dropped the bomb on hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Japan, that created tremendous moral reflection and doubt about whether or not our power with science had exceeded our ethical ability and our public policy ability to control that power. So we see the beginning of a turning inward and a doubt about our ability with science. And then in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded their own atomic bomb, and then in 1957 launched Sputnik. That introduced the possibility that they could launch a Sputnik that had a nuclear warhead in it and deliver nuclear warheads to the United States. That created a tremendous feeling of fear, which in turn created a science race and a space race. Space became the real focus of that nationalistic drive forward, and for the first time since World War II, we saw a return away from that doubt and more of a general public embrace of certain aspects of science, not all. But at the same time that we funded the National Science Foundation in 1958, we finally fully funded it, we didn't require scientists to do public outreach in order to get funding. Vannevar Bush had made the argument to Harry Truman in The Endless Frontier that if we invested in science in peacetime, we could move the nation forward just like we had in World War II, and we would be the dominant nation on the planet. And he was right. That investment paid off in a big, big way. Science and technology have created over half of the economic development of the United States since that time. But it didn't have any requirements for scientists to engage with the public. University tenure systems grew up that strongly discouraged public outreach, had many disincentives for scientists doing public outreach. And scientists like Edwin Hubble, for instance, who had spoken to great public audiences of 5,000 people, standing room only, about the great new discoveries in astronomy at the first part of the century, big screaming headlines across newspapers. Those kind of scientists didn't do that anymore. And we saw a removal of science from the public dialogue at the same time that the rest of the public was becoming very, very concerned about science. Billy Graham was evangelizing about science starting in 1949, talking about how we are in an armaments race to destruction. That was really the beginning of the resurgence of fundamentalist evangelism in the United States. At the same time, industry was reinvesting in their own public outreach. But the United States requires a plurality of voices to have balanced public policy, and with the voices of scientists falling silent, removing themselves from civics and the civic process, that balance began to skew out of balance. Then in 1962, with the publication of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, suddenly we realized that, for the first time, the general public realized that things that we had taken for granted in the benefits of science, for instance, children playing in clouds of DDT as it was sprayed through the neighborhood. It was fun. You know, you're hiding over there. I can't see you. All right. We discovered that that was a toxin. And the great benefits that we were seeing from some of those chemical advances in the environment were coming back and boomeranging back on us. And this wasn't just with DDT. It happened over and over again with 3 Mile Island, with the Dalcon Shield. All kinds of scientific advances that had been quickly commercialized suddenly were creating unanticipated environmental consequences and health consequences. So the public began to be very skeptical of science. At the same time, 10 years later, advances in vitro fertilization were leading to great moral and ethical reflection about our ability to control the human reproductive cycle. At the time, this is a 1972 Time magazine cover, talking about test tube babies, which is what we called in vitro fertilization at the time, and there was a great debate amongst fundamentalists about whether or not they would have souls. It turns out, I mean, all the evidence isn't in, but it seems like they do. Now that we've had millions of them among us, we better hope so. No, certainly we've learned from that process that ensoulment is not scientifically a proven issue, at least to this date, and in vitro does not interfere with it if it is. Now, let's see what has happened since then. That caused a great split. Those debates over ensoulment, over whether or not people would have souls, over the environmental consequences of commercialized science, over our control over the human reproductive cycle, created a big split between certain parts of the United States population and science. So you saw, on the one hand, old industry aligning with old religion, fundamentalism, and particularly the chemical industry, the petroleum industry, and certain other older industries finding themselves sharing common interests with fundamentalists. One objected to regulation, the other objected to any kind of contraception, abortion, anything to do with stem cell research, evolution, anything to do with the reproductive cycle, because that was God's plan and we were messing with it. Does that sound familiar to you? That's formed the basis of the modern alignment of the parties. On the other side, there were scientists and environmentalists. Now, there's an interesting correlation here. For instance, today, back in the Hubble's day, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the vast majority of scientists were Republican. And a lot of them were Republican because they had been driven away from the Democratic Party by people like William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president as a Democrat 3 times on the anti-evolution ticket. And after he lost to pro-science Republicans, William Howard Taft and William McKinley, he then went on throughout the South, largely, evangelizing in states, trying to get them to ban the teaching of evolution in science class. Tennessee bit. They passed a law requiring that no science class teach that humans were descended from lower orders of animals, like apes, they said. And that resulted in the Scopes monkey trial. The publicity from that really drove, and the battles around that, leading up to that, drove most scientists in the Republican Party. Today, interestingly enough, 2009, Pew Research did a national poll, and of those scientists who identified party affiliation, 9 out of 10 said they were Democrats. So things have really flipped, and it's about this particular science issue. So the anti-science messaging on the political right is about socialism, usually. And we hear those arguments, right? And that's because it's about the increased power that science has given the individual, but the increased economic and environmental effects that that power is having. So any attempt to regulate that is charged with being socialist. So the anti-science there we see is around climate change, evolution, and reproduction. On the right, there is also anti-science, but it's of a different sort. There it's about hidden dangers. It's about unsupported suspicions that science is creating hidden dangers to health or the environment. So there's suspicion against the man in mainstream medicine, or against cell phones, the idea that cell phones may cause brain cancer, or the idea that vaccines may cause autism, completely unsupported by all the science that's been done on it, or that EMF, electromagnetic waves, may be polluting our environment and causing cancer. No science to support that. GMO crops, how they are supposedly somehow much worse than organic foods. We've been altering the genetics of our crops for thousands of years. We're just doing it with more precision now. So the motivations on both sides are also interesting to understand or to explore. On the one hand, it's anti-regulation, anti-reproductive control, and pro-corporate, and on the other, it's pro-environment, pro-choice, and anti-corporate. So the theme on the right that you'll hear people like Rush Limbaugh talking about is that liberal scientists with a socialist agenda want to control your life and limit your freedom. Now, the reason that Rush can say this kind of thing is that liberal has become falsely conflated with progressive. But liberal is, again, not a left-right thing. It's a top-down. On the left, it's impersonal doctors, greedy corporations, and mechanistic scientists hide the real danger to health, environment, and your spirit. So the problem with the Republican version these days is that there's a great deal of science that actually supports regulation. And science has given us increasing control over the reproductive cycle that has benefited many of us. It has given the power to have children to those who could not. It has also given the power to not have children to those who otherwise would have until such point as they want to. To that extent, it has interfered with God's plan, but as Richard Murdoch talked about the other day, I would rather interfere with that plan. I don't think that it's God's will that rapists should make us pregnant. The important thing about this discussion is that much of it has happened without the involvement of scientists. This has been those who are largely not trained in scientists muttering amongst themselves in the public dialogue for the last 50 years and arriving at these battles. This is one reason why Matthew and I work to elevate science in the public dialogue, because to the extent that we can model good thinking, hold the media accountable for anti-science statements, have politicians on the record with scientists in the room, we can begin to steer the national dialogue back a little bit towards knowledge and away from people muttering amongst themselves about ideology and whatever else whatever other prejudices they may bring into the argument. Because looking at this, you can see that it's virtually impossible for people at either end of the spectrum to get along with each other, to see eye to eye, or to form any kind of cogent public policy whatsoever. And that's why we're seeing gridlock. One of the reasons we're seeing gridlock. Now, we are, and this is what I think people in this room really need to face, we are having a cold civil war over science. And it's not me that's just saying that, it's people like James Dobson, who says that we're in a civil war of values. Or Lord Monckton, who in 2010 at the Koch brothers funded Tax Day Tea Party rally in Washington, D.C. said, now we're met on the great battlefield of a new civil war. The greatest part of that battlefield is a global warming battle. So these people feel that they are in a battle over these science issues. And compromise when you're in a battle is not very easy. This is why we're having such fierce arguments over these discussions. So here's an example of how that turns into our political battling. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, this was in regard with global warming, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue. So that's a tactic in that battle that we are seeing, right? Constantly casting doubt on the scientific certainty. But it's not just with global warming, it's also, for instance, redefining what pregnancy means. Now pregnancy, according to certain people, happens at conception. Well, how can a woman be said to be pregnant if there are, say, 20 fertilized eggs frozen in a reproductive center? Has she undergone the biochemical changes to say that she's pregnant? No, she hasn't. So, there we go. So, consider now the influences of all of these different factors in our public dialogue today, and the effect that it has had on the leading candidates from the perhaps most historically honored party, arguably in some ways, founded by Abraham Lincoln, for president, and how they have been able to take these outrageously anti-science positions.
There's a woman who came up crying to me tonight after the debate. She said her daughter was given that vaccine. She told me her daughter suffered mental retardation as a result of that vaccine. There are very dangerous consequences. It's not good enough to take, quote, a mulligan, or you want a do-over, not when you have little children's lives at risk.
Man-made global warming is poppycock. I hope I can say that on your show.
You know you can.
In other words, I don't believe in it. Look, if people look at the real data, the climate has varied ever since we have known that the planet was here. And we know that those scientists who tried to concoct the science to say that we had a hockey stick global warming and they were busted because they manipulated the data. No. If man-made global warming is not a crisis.
Now you can see Frank Lutz's strategy at work there, right? Casting doubt on the scientific certainty. The interesting thing about this, Michelle Bachmann, she's her own special case. I happen to live in her district and know her somewhat well. My wife was a state representative at the same time Michelle was a state senator. So I've got some interesting stories that I can share, but I won't right here now. Herman Cain, however, is a different story. He was also in Minnesota at the time when he was CEO of Godfather's Pizza, and was well respected amongst business circles. So what is he doing? Why is he embracing this really preposterous position that is not supported by any science? What is driving him, and what is driving these other candidates to do this? And why don't they feel that they will be publicly penalized for doing this?
For evolution to explain the creation of the human species from nothing to human beings, absolutely not. I don't believe in that.
HPV, forcing 12-year-old girls to take an inoculation to prevent this sexually transmitted disease. This is not good medicine. I do not believe. I think it's social mischief, and not so.
But I'm opposed to getting involved in the process of killing children in order to have research in children. And I think you're finding, you look at what's happening with stem cell research, we have less and less demand that you have anything except regular stem cells because we're learning how to use them.
Now, I think that we can all agree in this room that we are all opposed to the process of killing children in order to get research material. So we can agree with Newt there. Newt is an interesting case. Newt is a supporter of sciencedebate.org. He told me, I'll do anything I can to support science. And he did oversee the doubling of the funding for the National Institutes of Health, even at the same time that he undermined the funding for the Office of Technology Assessment. So in some ways he's done more damage than he has good. In others he's been very, very pro-science. So for him to be finding a way to make such an anti-science statement tells you again about the dynamics at play in this process right now and how they are coming into our public dialogue. Newt saw a bounce in the polls after he made that statement. In fact, most of these statements happened when candidates were sinking in the polls, and then they subsequently saw a bounce in the polls. So this tells you that there are Republican activists right now who are controlling the delegate process, who are largely anti-science that are being catered to. At least that's the conclusion that I draw from it.
You yourself have said the party is in danger of becoming anti-science. Who on the stage is anti-science? Listen, when you make comments that fly in the face of what 98 out of 100 climate scientists have said, when you call into question the science of evolution, all I am saying is that in order for the Republican Party to win, we can't run from science.
That didn't work out so well for him, did it? He was the most ardently pro-science candidate in the Republican primaries, and he finished last in the polls. Now, he seems perfectly reasonable to people who live here in New York. But to Republican activists in the Midwest or in the West, he seems like the Antichrist. And that's the problem. That's why he didn't finish.
Governor Huntsman was not specific about names, but the two of you do have a difference of opinion about climate change. Just recently in New Hampshire, you said that weekly or even daily, scientists are coming forward to question the idea that human activity is behind climate change. Which scientists have you found most credible on this subject?
Well, I do agree that the science is not settled on this. The idea that we would put Americans' economy at jeopardy based on scientific theory that's not settled yet, to me is nonsense. I mean, and I tell somebody, I said, just because you have a group of scientists that stood up and said, here is the fact, Galileo got outvoted for a spell.
Right, by people like him. Now again, we see this emphasis on casting doubt on the science, falsely saying that it's not settled.
I don't speak for the scientific community, of course, but I believe the world's getting warmer. I can't prove that, but I believe based on what I read that the world's getting warmer. And number two, I believe that humans contribute to that.
Now, this is Governor Romney at his first town hall meeting after announcing his run for the presidency. This was in New Hampshire in June of last year. And the very first question that he was asked about was about climate change. And this was his answer, and I wrote pre-Rush Romney on there because 4 days later, and now we begin to see some of the powers in play here that emerged. 4 days later, Rush Limbaugh went on his radio show, and this is what he said about Romney's statement.
Bye-bye nomination. Bye-bye nomination, up and down. We're in the midst here of discovering that this is all a hoax. The last year has established that the whole premise of man-made global warming is a hoax.
Not only does he think it's a hoax, but it's the question of ideological purity. You're not even allowed to voice any doubt. That's why I say that there's authoritarianism that's really the battle that's going on here. Bye-bye nomination, just for saying that. Just for voicing the statement that he's said many times, but now he's in play for president. So wanting that nomination, and this illustrates what these candidates have to do. Wanting the nomination, Governor Romney had to adjust his rhetoric if he was going to succeed. So by October of last year, this is what he was saying.
My view is that we don't know what's causing climate change on this planet, and the idea of spending trillions and trillions of dollars to try and reduce CO2 emissions is not the right course for us.
So quite a dramatic change in his position. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware of Representative Todd Akin, who sits on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. So when he speaks on a topic, you would think that he speaks with some authority if it's a science topic. He certainly has access to it. The House Science, Space, and Technology Committee is one of the primary government oversight mechanisms and funding mechanisms for the U.S. science enterprise, funding a vast array of scientific investment throughout our federal agencies and universities. So that's why it was particularly shocking when he was asked his opinion on this particular science issue.
Abortion could be considered in case of, say, tubal pregnancy or something like that. What about in the case of rape? Should it be legal or not?
Well, you know, people always want to try and make that as one of those things. Well, how do you slice this particularly tough sort of ethical question? It seems to me, first of all, from what I understand from doctors, that's really rare. If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down.
Now, when I heard this, I immediately started working in an article because I wanted to really see and talk about what I thought it was stunning, first of all, that this man was sitting on the House Science Committee, but I also wanted to see what science really said about it, whether he was telling us the truth about pregnancy and rape from his knowledge on that science committee. And what I found was that, well, in fact, there is no observed biological mechanism to shut that whole thing down. I think most of the women in the room probably can testify to that. But also, it is not extremely rare. In fact, what science there is shows that women may be up to twice as likely to become pregnant from rape. We don't understand why that is. Perhaps something to do with victim selection or pheromones. We just don't know. There must be some mechanism at play that we don't understand. But the science that we do know so far indicates that statistical correlation. So it's not extremely rare. Where does he get this from? Well, perhaps this is the doctor that he's talking to. Dr. Paul Brown, a medical doctor, also sits on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And here he was just about 2 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago.
I've come to understand that all this stuff I was talking about, evolution, embryology, Big Bang Theory, all that is lies straight from the pit of hell. And it's lies to try to keep me and all the folks who we talk about from understanding that they need a Savior. You see, there are a lot of scientific data that I found out as a scientist that actually show that this is really a young Earth. I don't believe that the Earth's about 9,000 years old. I believe it was created in 6 days as we know them. That's what the Bible says. And what I've come to learn is that it's the manufacturer's handbook, is what I call it. It teaches us how to run our lives individually, how to run our families, how to run our churches. But it teaches us how to run all the public policy and everything in society. And that's the reason, as your congressman, I hold the Holy Bible as being the major directions to me of how I vote in Washington, D.C., and I'll continue to do that.
If anybody's in Georgia and they come down with anything, I'd recommend not visiting Dr. Brown. This view is the exact opposite of the idea that Jefferson was reaching for, isn't it? Because it's pulling government out of the expansive view and the more limited argument of basing public policy and knowledge. And he's saying it right there, basing it on what's in that Bible. But that turns us into theocracy, and that turns our public policy decisions into decisions that can be argued with constantly by people of different faith. And that puts us at loggerheads, and it breaks down democracy as we know it. It's understandable that Representative Brown would have his views if he were brought up in the tradition of evangelical fundamentalism, which seeks to make disciples of all nations, the Great Commission in Matthew. But they apply it literally, because they are literalists. And if you were brought up in this view, this is a cartoon by Ken Ham, who is, in this case, exhorting priests to do a better job, or men of the clergy to do a better job. If you're brought up in this view, it's easy to see why embracing the idea of evolution could be very threatening to you, because here we see the evil scientist dressed like a pirate hammering away at creation on his island of evolution, and we all know that evolution is a product of Satan, because it says so there. And the priests are stupidly firing off in the wrong direction, aiming at one of their own, or silly knocking away one of the many symptoms of evolution. And these are things we all associate with evolution, like homosexuality, and euthanasia, divorce, and abortion, and racism. We all know that those are the products of evolution, right? Well, that was actually William Jennings Bryan's argument, that evolution undermined the biblical foundation of morality. And this is that argument really illustrated in this comic. But it's easy to see, if this is what you've been brought up believing, how it is an existential threat to your identity, to your social network. You'll be ostracized if you start to question this authoritarian view. And it's not just Republicans. I've been doing a lot of picking on Republicans right now because a lot of the big public policy challenges that are breaking down democracy are coming from fundamentalist Republican activists and corporate interests that are anti-science because it interferes with their economic model. But that is translated into a broader influence in our public discussion. Here's an example from the discussion in Congress last year of internet regulation.
From my perspective, just as an old country boy, and you know, this the only way I can understand this complex.
Really?
We need parallels on the virtual, in the virtual world to what we have in the real world, and I think this bill draws the appropriate balance.
I'm not a nerd.
I am not a nerd.
I'm just not enough of a nerd. Maybe we ought to ask some nerds what this thing really does. Let's have a hearing, bring in the nerds.
So, first of all, here we have the ranking member on the committee responsible for regulation of the internet saying, well, the only way I can understand this complex stuff is what is going on here. It's the influence of bullies in our public policy, the authoritarian influence again. Politicians don't want to be perceived as nerds now. Everybody seems to have bought the argument that politicians should be somebody you want to sit down and have a beer with. I don't care personally if I have a beer with whoever represents me in Congress. I'd rather that they do a good job making public policy. And actually, we started testing that. We started hearing back when we started trying to work, Matthew and I, on science debate. We started hearing back from the presidential campaigns that they thought that science was a niche topic. Nobody was interested in it. So we decided to test that idea. We went to science, and we did a national poll. We commissioned Harris to do a national poll, and we found out that, in fact, 85% of the American public, Democrats and Republicans to an identical percentage, within a tenth of a percentage point, thought that the candidates should be talking about these issues and debating them. So the public is way ahead of the politicians on this. The politicians are stuck in 20th century thinking in a 21st century, where science is dominating our public policy, and yet nobody is actually effectively talking about it. So we are continuing to let these problems sit unsolved. And that's what we're trying to work on to transform. So here's another example. I'm not hopeful that it's going to end anytime soon, because those who run for Congress bubble up through state legislatures, right? North Carolina tried to make sea level rise illegal this year. And what they did was they passed a bill that, and this is just so reminiscent, again, authoritarianism of Maoist China. The state required local governments to get approval from the state before they could even begin to plan for sea level rise. And those who didn't have the approval couldn't plan. And those who did have the approval could only consider the historical last 100 years of sea level rise of 8 inches, not what scientists were saying, which they're projecting a sea level rise of 3 to 4 feet for that area. So in making vast public policy investments, roads, how high do you elevate it? What kind of barriers do you make for storm surge? Who do you permit to build where? Science or local governments could consider none of that evidence in making public policy decisions and spending taxpayer dollars. Those people are on their way to Congress. Virginia did a similar thing, but they weren't quite that radical about it. They just banned the term sea level rise, replacing it with recurrent flooding, because sea level rise, as we all know, is a left-wing term. Any science can become politicized. It's not just these things that we've been talking about. And I'll give you an example from about 90 years ago. Nowadays we hear Rush Limbaugh talking about how climate change is a hoax. We hear Senator Inhofe talking. I can't believe this, that this is a U.S. senator saying it's the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. In Weimar, Germany, a similar thing happened with relativity theory. At the time, in the 1920s, right-wing relativity deniers said that relativity was a big hoax, that it was Jewish science and that Einstein was just in it for the money. Much like they say about climate scientists today. Same exact talking points, pretty much. At the time, Einstein said the world is a strange madhouse. Currently, every coachman and every waiter is debating whether relativity theory is correct. Belief in this matter depends on political party affiliation. Sound familiar? So the question then is the public just stupid? What's going on? Are people stupid? No, not really. And here's a chart that illustrates why. 2008, Pew did a study and found that Republicans who were not college educated, 31% believed that humans were changing the climate. Amongst those who were, the number fell to 19%. So scientists have long believed that it's just a deficit in education. You just pour more education in and the people will make smarter decisions. Turns out that's not the case. In fact, a lot of new research shows that emotions drive much of our reasoning, and a lot of our reasoning is actually a rationalization of the emotional conclusions that we come to. And science, in fact, is really the most unique method that we've come up with to fight that impulse, to remove knowledge from, as Bacon said, all the many ways, the countless ways that the affections, as he called them, can influence the reasoning. Now, this isn't just happening on the political right. Amongst Democrats, liberal whole food shoppers that are well off are more likely to be vaccine refusers. So this happens, again, on both sides. Why? Because with higher education, people feel more entitled to be critical. They think of it as critical thinking. And they've been trained in critical thinking. But something's happened in our education system over the last 40 years that has taught only part of critical thinking. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. But the essential link that's missing is tying critical thinking back to the requirement to have evidence. Here's another example. In 2001, NSF did a survey on science literacy and found that 53% of American adults were unaware that the last dinosaur died before the first human arose, probably because they saw them together on the Flintstones. 47% were unaware that human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals. Okay, 47%, so more than half knew that. Right? But something very, very interesting happened in the next 60 years. By 2007, nearly 60% of U.S. adults stated their belief that God created humans in their present form less than 10,000 years ago. So we went from 47% to 60%, a 13% increase, or a rate of change of roughly, 25% more people thinking that in just 6 years. What happened? Did they get stupider? No. What happened over that term is, number one, Republicans, interestingly, controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency, and President Bush was in a very, very tough re-election battle. In fact, he had lost 18 million evangelical voters in 2000 when he was elected. So in 2004, his chief strategist, Karl Rove, himself an atheist, by the way, was walking through the West Wing whistling "Onward Christian Soldiers." And he had developed a strategy of mobilizing fundamentalist evangelical voters and campaigning through churches over family values issues. And one of those family values was creationism and whether or not intelligent design ought to be taught in science class. That motivated a lot of voters to go out, carry the message for the Bush ticket, and evangelize, essentially. So what happened? Did they really change their beliefs by doing this? Turns out, no, they didn't. In fact, at the same time, in 2004, in the year of the height of that campaigning, and this is why I bring this up as an example, at the very height of that campaigning, University of Michigan did a study, and they added the words, according to scientists, human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals. Very interesting thing happened. 72% got it right, not 47% or 40% in this case. So big leap. Why? Because it turns out people can hold competing worldviews in their minds at the same time. It's called framing. They can hold the faith frame and they can also hold the knowledge frame. The problem we're having right now is not that people are dumb, it's just that they don't value knowledge. Knowledge needs to be articulated again as a human value. What you people talk about is time binding, right? The accumulation of knowledge over time. We need to value that again, and we need public policy leaders to reassert the importance of basing public policy on knowledge as the fairest, most moral, most ethical way of arriving at a conclusion that benefits everyone. Well, maybe the media will help us in this effort. That's what Matthew and I thought in 2007, 2008. And in January of 2008, in fact, we and others noticed that these 5 top TV news anchors had then asked the candidates almost 3,000 questions, candidates for president, in 171 different interviews. How many do you suppose were about climate change? Arguably the biggest public policy challenge we're facing. How many? 0? 100? Do I hear 50? 6. 6 out of 3,000. To put that in perspective, 3 questions were about UFOs. So it gives you a sense of the relative importance that the National Press Corps places on issues, science issues like climate change. Why is that? Perhaps there's some confirmation bias going on there. If you think about who went into media, and I've talked to many people in media, Matthew and I actually work in media in the other sides of our lives. Most people in media, their last science class was in high school and they hated it, which is why they went into the humanities and into media. So they assume that nobody else is interested either. Confirmation bias. It turns out that's not true. They're less interested than the public as a whole. This leads us to something called false balance, which is a big problem right now in our public dialogue. In journalism, there's always 2 sides to every story. Bob says 2 + 2 is 4, Julie says it's 6. The controversy rages, right? You can sell newspapers that way. Who's right? Is it Bob or is it Julie? You can get all kinds of opinion leaders and pundits to say, well, I think Bob's right, but if you really look at complex math, maybe there could be an argument for Julie being right. Science says most times one side is simply wrong. I can show you clearly with these apples that Bob is right. Then we have politics. How about a compromise? That's our public dialogue in a nutshell right there. Pass a new law, 2 + 2 = 5. The reason that this is a problem is that false balance weights us towards extremism in our public dialogue, because it places one person, say, on one half of the screen or in half of the article that is a scientist or an expert that is voicing an expert opinion that is based on all the accumulated knowledge on the topic so far. And then the other half, you put some yahoo with an opinion. And you treat them like they're balanced views when they're not, because one is based on all that knowledge, all that research by hundreds, thousands of people sometimes, millions, billions of dollars sometimes, versus somebody with an opinion. So that skews our public dialogue away from knowledge and towards extreme views. And the media is complicit in that. And one example of this false balance is David Gregory. David Gregory, at the time of the run-up to the Iraq War, was the NBC White House chief correspondent. And after the run-up, when it became clear that there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and all the other reasons for rationale for entry had been shown to be false, he was asked, how come? Why, you guys? Why didn't anybody in the press corps push President Bush or the administration harder about not having any evidence, to at least show us the evidence, have a transparent and open public dialogue about this and about whether or not Al-Qaeda had anything to do with Saddam Hussein and whether or not there really were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And he said, I respectfully disagree. It's not our role. Well, if it's not the media's role in a democracy, whose role is it? And what happens to democracy? The ship of democracy then is left rudderless and it begins to drift. This is why Jefferson valued public education and a critical press as so important, because they are the means of keeping democracy protected from tyranny. That's why the press is protected in the Bill of Rights. Well, what happens? In the media right now, the reason that David Gregory feels that it's not their role is that members of the media are continually taught this one thing. There is no such thing as objectivity. And this is something that comes out of the thinking of postmodernism, deconstructionism, social constructivism. It goes under all those different terms, but it's essentially the idea that was developed by humanities professors in the 1960s and 70s that said that science did not have the real claim on truth. They were upset at being deposed by science in university departments And science did not have the real claim on truth, that we all had different ways of knowing, and science was just one way of knowing. It was the way of knowing of Western white men, but it was no more important than the ways of knowing of Aborigines, or women, or African Americans, or Native Americans, or any other political identity group. That is valuable and true as a perspective when it comes to politics and people's rights to participate in our public dialogue and in their career paths. But it is simply false when it comes to science. Science is all about, remember your empiricism, creating knowledge that is separate from our political identity, from our gender identity, from all the ways that we can confuse ourselves with emotion, with all those other things, because it requires us to create knowledge that can be independently verified by other people, regardless of what political identity they have. Yet, journalism schools are continuing to teach this. Linda Ellerby, there's no such thing as objectivity. Here we go, of all people, Nick Gillespie, the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine, the leading libertarian publication, there's no such thing as objectivity. You'd think if anybody would think that there was objectivity, it would be an objectivist. So where does this drive us to? Well, people like Bruno Latour, one of the founders of postmodernism, now really regret it, saying that entire PhD programs are still running, teaching people that there's no such thing as objectivity, that facts are made up. And these ideas have been appropriated by the right. You think about the people in charge now who are making these arguments, they went to college under this. Back at the time, Woody Allen lampooned it as mental masturbation. Rush Limbaugh started his career criticizing political correctness by putting that political imperative over knowledge. But it has since morphed into an authoritarian approach, because if there is no knowledge, what are we left with to base public policy on? We're left with endless warring opinions, neither more valid than the other. Who wins the argument in that case? The person with the biggest megaphone, or the biggest wallet, or the biggest club. So, Latour now regrets it in some ways. Was I wrong to participate in the invention of this field known as science studies? Is it enough to say that we not really mean what we said? Why does it burn my tongue to say that global warming is a fact, whether you like it or not? So this is how the problem creates itself. We used to have a governance issue. This was Jefferson's virtuous circle of democracy. Governance issue, we had turned to the educated and informed mass of the people, education, media. They would in turn commission scientific research, as Jefferson often did. For instance, Lewis and Clark was a scientific expedition to build knowledge in order to make informed public policy decisions based on that knowledge. The circle goes around and around, and we have a functional democracy. What's happening now, and why is it a problem? When vested interests get involved and provide alternative theories to children and propaganda to adults, all of a sudden the educated and informed mass of the people is no more. They're moved out of the conversation, the political dialogue. And instead then of turning to scientific research to build knowledge, we act like Representative Shimkus, and we turn to authority and ideology for knowledge. And then instead of debating the best public policy based on knowledge, we base it on dogma. And that's why we see the rise of faith-based approaches, and why we see continual arguments over from many of the people running for office today over religious issues. So what is this a real recipe for? Authoritarianism, right? And that's what that vertical battle that we're seeing right now is all about. So what can we do? Well, Matthew and I and a few others decided to put up this website called Science Debate 2008. And at the time, we reached out to other scientists, to scientists and others that we knew, and began asking them to spread the word. It was Matthew, I, the physicist Lawrence Krauss, the science journalist Chris Mooney, at the time a marine biologist Cheryl Kirschenbaum, now she's an energy expert, and the science philosopher Austin Dacey. And the six of us worked our networks and kind of competed with each other to see how many cool people we could bring in as signers. And before we knew it, within a few weeks, this thing exploded. It went viral, and we had 39,000 scientists and engineers that had signed on. We were co-sponsored. Matthew and I went down to D.C. and met with the presidents of the national academies, and they signed on as co-sponsors. The AAAS came on as a co-sponsor. The Council of competitiveness, plus over 100 leading U.S. universities, many Nobel laureates, and even members of Congress, in addition to the CEOs of major U.S. companies like Intel and Texas Instruments, science and technology-oriented companies. So with all that backing, you'd think that the candidates for president would be interested in responding. We organized a science debate in Philadelphia at the Franklin Institute right before the Pennsylvania primary. McCain ignored us. Clinton and Obama engaged with us in conversation, but then suddenly said, no, we can't do it, we have a scheduling conflict. Turned out that the conflict was they had a compassion forum at Messiah College in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So what has happened to our public dialogue where it is more taboo to talk about science than it is to talk about religion? That's a very interesting question. So the result of this, of just a few people trying to do good, is an illustration and perhaps hope for everyone in this room. Because if 6 of us can have a large impact on the public dialogue, because ultimately science debate did engage President Obama and Senator McCain and wound up making 850 million media impressions around the world, changing the dialogue. Here's another effect that it had. President Obama even quoted from our mission statement in his inaugural address, and he appointed these 5 scientists who were early supporters of science debate to run different agencies in his administration. There's John Holdren, who became Presidential Science Advisor, Steve Chu, who became Energy Secretary, Jane Lubchenco, who worked with Matthew and I to try and create a science debate in Oregon after the Pennsylvania one failed, past president of the AAAS. Now she's the Undersecretary of Commerce and the Director of NOAA. Harold Varmus, who actually was the main person that really pushed the Obama administration to finally engage with us. He is now the Director of the National Cancer Institute, and Marcia McNutt, my fellow Minnesotan, who is now the Director of the U.S. Geological Survey. So if the 6 of us can have an impact on the public dialogue, any table in this room can have an impact on the public dialogue, especially in this day and age when we're enabled by technology. For the first time, a president went into office with a clear idea of how science was integral to his overall strategic objective. Within a month of being in office, he instituted new policies that worked very strongly to improve the scientific integrity of decision-making throughout the executive branch. In 2012, we were able to do the same thing by getting President Obama and Governor Romney to answer a series of 14 similar questions. We organized the U.S. science enterprise again, 15 or 16 of the top science organizations. We crowdsourced science questions that intersected with public policy, like climate change, like vaccines, 14 of them again, and we put them to these candidates, and they were gracious and kind enough to answer them on our website. I encourage you to go to sciencedebate.org and see where they stand on these issues and how they think about them, and see whether there are any common themes that run through any of their answers. And finally, I think that we are making progress with the mainstream media, who are slowly starting to value this, moving from just science publications to a lot of mainstream publications who are now covering this effort, or who are asking why it is that the candidates answered the question about climate change in writing but have refused to address it in the debates, and why none of the moderators have brought it up in the debates. It turns out that sciencedebate.org is pretty much the only place you can find their positions on climate change. So what can we do moving forward? Again, realize that we are in a cold civil war. That's not my term, that's the other side's term. Hold the media accountable. That means write letters to the editor, call them up, email them, criticize them if you have a blog. When they engage in this kind of false balance, postmodern reporting that is really a dodge of their ultimate responsibility of doing service to the voters and helping inform them about public policy issues that have input from science. Speak up for objectivity and tolerance. Science is a meritocracy. It's not about intolerance. In fact, it can't succeed if it is intolerant, because new ideas can come from anywhere. Run for local office yourself. I know here in New York that's less of an issue than it is perhaps where I live, where we're in a constant jujitsu battle with these people. But it's important. I tell scientists when I speak to them, consider running and joining the Republican Party, because there are actually very few people that control this delegate process, if you think about it. Just a couple thousand of them, ultimately. And there are millions of scientists in the United States. So if you get involved and become a delegate, maybe you can have an influence. Support sciencedebate.org. Sign the petition to encourage candidates to participate in this. Not only did we get presidential candidates to participate, we asked all the leaders in Congress that sit on key leadership positions and science committees to respond. 9 of them did, so we're making slow progress there, not as fast as we'd like, but we're getting there. Also we're starting to have influence in some gubernatorial races. So sign that petition, give us money if you can. We're volunteer. We don't take a salary. We use the money to support our website and to support our travel and speaking. Of course, you can always buy my book right back there in the back of the room. I have to put that pitch in. And finally, I'll leave you with this closing observation.
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you." If fool me, can't get fooled again.
So, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it. And thank you for your work and your support of General Semantics.